Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACI Microsegmentation with Secure Workload Part 1. So this will be a series demonstrating how you can leverage secure workload in your ACI environments to achieve and operationalize an efficient segmentation strategy. So my name is Jorge Quintero, and I am a Senior Cybersecurity Solutions Engineer. So why are we here, right? And the main reason why we're here is a journey that started some years ago, right? Since the inception of ACI, in a matter of fact, where we wanted to move, or the vision back then was to move this data center fabrics from that network-centric view, right? Where you were deploying this networking infrastructure, either on this classical three-tier architecture or just using networking constructs where you will be you were deploying your application workloads. So the idea of ACI was to eventually move from that network-centric deployment style to a more application-centric, where the applications are the ones driven the network fabric, right? So now your network follows the application and not the other way around. Now, this has been a challenge for our customers, and there are many reasons why. The very first one is, of course, the difficulty to manage the networking constructs on ACI, right? And this case is specifically related to the EPG or endpoint group. And this EPG construct on ACI, it's actually a construct that has two main functions. One is for networking, right? To describe and apply networking functions on the ACI fabric. And the other one has to do with security, right? For example, to apply segmentation policies between different endpoint groups. Another challenge that we have seen from customers, of course, is the lack of visibility and understanding of how those applications behaves, right? And rightly so, because the operators of ACI fabrics or software-defined networking to that extent are network engineers, and in some instances as well, network security engineers, where they don't have the ownership, neither the understanding of the application workloads. And lastly, the resource limitations, right? Specifically the TCAM. So we understand as well by now that that is a very precious resource under your switching infrastructure, and the more segmentation policies that you deploy, the more it will be consumed, with, of course, the risk of getting it exhausted. Now, there has been some introductions on ACI to mitigate a couple of those risks. For example, more resources on the latest generation switches, as well as the introduction of the ESG construct that is dedicated just for the security use case, right? So you can then divide those functions. So EPG will handle only the networking functions of the fabric, whereas ESG will handle the security functions. Now, you will notice that I have here under the management plane actually three managers, right? And the value here is that it's an ecosystem or even platform integration that you will have available with Secure Workload, APIC, and Firewall Management Center to achieve that application-centric, right? To start a journey and finally land in the application-centric deployment mode. And what we're looking at here is that APIC, right, that is the manager for ACI, to get in charge of the infrastructure orchestration and deployment. This means that it will be in charge of deploying the networking functions, programming the switches, right, and essentially taking care of all the fabric itself. We have Secure Workload that will ingest telemetry from the network to discover those application dependencies, right, and suggest policies for you to apply onto the network to achieve that allow list policy model for applications. And lastly, the Firewall Management Center. Right, now, why would we have the Firewall Management Center here on the picture? And the reason is that, as we understand, right, there is a resource limitation on the ACI fabric, that is specifically the TCAM. And even though the newer generation switches has more capability, more resources, they are still not a firewall, right? They were not built to be a firewall to handle thousands, if not millions, of access control lists, right? And here's where the firewalls enter into place, a purpose-built appliance to do firewalling and controlling in the environment, right? In this case, on the ACI fabric. So the benefits of this ecosystem integration and platform, right, is first and foremost to automate the policy lifecycle management, right? So with secure workload, we can get the telemetry from the network and discover those policies that you can push either directly to APIC, so the ACI manager, or to secure firewall if you need, right? Or even use secure workload if you want to use agents or enforcement directly at the workload level. And this policy lifecycle management is intent-based, so it's in human language, right? You don't need to worry about any networking construct. It also helps you to operationalize efficiently that segmentation policies because, as I said before, right, it's an intent-based policy with no resources constraint, right? Because we're managing it directly from secure workload, and it's pushing that policy in a distributed fashion into your ACI fabric. And lastly, you can do separation of duties where the network operation folks can manage, right, the infrastructure deployment and infrastructure operations of the fabric, whereas the network security or security guys can handle the segmentation policies or security policies that you need in your environment. Now, in this series, the part one of our secure workload and ACI microsegmentation integration, we will talk about the ACI and the secure firewall insertion and adding secure workload on top of this to achieve that microsegmentation strategy to deploy those segmentation policies in your environment. And here is where, with the firewall insertion, what we're looking at is to insert the firewall in the path of those EPGs or ESG constructs on ACI, do a policy-based redirect to the firewall, right? And this is by means of the fabric. Get the telemetry from the firewall directly, discover those policies on workload, and push those policies to the firewall management center that will lastly push the policies into the firewall enforcement point, right? This method is agentless, right? So you don't need to install any agent on your workloads. And the benefits of this approach is that the segmentation level is up to your needs, right? Up to your use case. You can achieve acceptable fine-grained segmentation, say for only certain segments or only specific workloads, or reasonable, meaning up to the subnet level, right? If you need to, right? For example, if you need to redirect all the traffic from an EPG or different workloads, right, that are within an EPG that may be on the same subnet. And of course, with the benefit of this approach, you can have multi-tier policy management, right? Policies that can be owned by secure workload, others by the firewall management center persona, and lastly, ones or other policies owned by the networking guys on ACI, right? So we can achieve that policy multi-management. The other approach that we have, and this will be for the second series, or part two of the series, is the ACI and secure workload native integration. Now, in this case, there is no firewall, right? We're getting the telemetry from the agents directly. So you will install an agent on your workloads. And the reason why we strongly recommend to install the agents is because by having the agents on the workloads, we can get 100% accuracy on the telemetry and policy discovery for those workloads. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot use agentless. You can still leverage agentless telemetry, and that is in the means of getting, for example, NetFlow or ERSpan from the network for secure workload to discover those policies. But of course, since we are not at the very point of the source, right? We're not there on the workload, the accuracy might be less. The second part is, of course, getting the endpoint discovery from APIC, right? Where we discover all the different endpoints that are installed on the ACI fabric, alongside the TCAM resource utilization. And lastly, we will push policies directly to APIC so it can then push those policies into the ACI fabric. So the three main use cases, of course, is visibility, where we will do the ACI endpoint and policy discovery. We will do enforcement directly on APIC using ACI ESG constructs and contracts. And lastly, we will monitor continuously the TCAM utilization of ACI. Now we will jump into the demo, but before jumping into the environment, just want to perhaps lay out the scenario, right? Where we have three different breach domains, right? And under these breach domains, we have three EPGs. And those three EPGs are assigned to different subnets. Now we're grouping those EPGs into a single application profile that is called network segments. Now, this network segments application profile, I'm only using it for networking functions. I'm not doing any security or segmentation with them. I have then an additional application profile that is called SciWeb, where I am classifying and organizing the different endpoints, right, on ACI in one single ESG, right, where we will have our web tier or app tier and database tier of our application. Now, under this specific application profile is where we're building contracts, right? And those contracts are simple. The very first one is the SciWeb application permitting access from all the endpoints on external subnet, right? In this case, that filtering is done by the north-south firewall, right? I will not cover that part on this specific demo, right? But for your awareness, right? That even though we're allowing all that traffic, this traffic is actually being filtered by that north-south firewall. And the same applies to the contract that is permitting to all of those endpoints on the external subnets, right? So in this case, this SciWeb application is both the source and destination for external objects or endpoints or users, right, that are outside of the fabric, where we have the north-south firewall filtering that traffic for us. And lastly, the third contract is actually an intra-ESG contract. And what we want to do with this contract is that we're grouping all of those different endpoints under DSG. We're allowing them to communicate within themselves, but we're then doing a PBR or policy-based redirect to redirect that traffic flow into our east-west firewall in the fabric, right? Where we will stream the telemetry to Secure Workload to discover the policies, and lastly, apply the access control on the firewall directly. And for reference, this is how our SciWeb application is deployed. We have a front end, right, that is acting as the load balancer, communicating to the application tier or the business logic of the application, and those workloads are communicating then to a database tier that is behind a load balancer, right, just in the middle. All right, so I will jump into our environment. Let's see here. Let me log in again. Okay, so I will log in again to the ACI Fabric. Let's log into our Fabric infrastructure. I will navigate into tenants. And I will click on the Tech Elevate tenant. So under the Tech Elevate tenant, I will first navigate into the application profiles. And you can see here that I have a couple of those application profiles. The very first one that I will click on is the network segments. And here is the one that we're using to define those application APGs for the networking functions. If I click on the SciWeb, you will notice that I have no application APGs. However, I'm using the endpoint security groups to group all of those different endpoints in for the SciWeb application, right, that are under those breach domains and APGs. We can see here the multiple endpoints that it has learned and how I am leveraging the IP subnet selector as that selector option to classify those different endpoints. Under the contracts, we will see as well that I have 3 contracts, right? One that is permitting traffic from all sidewalk from all the endpoints, right? And the other one is permitting sidewalk to all the endpoints, right? So I'm basically allowing traffic in and out of the application that might be outside of the fabric, right? Or any endpoint for that matter. And the last one is actually the intra-ESG contract, right? That I will use for redirection into the firewall. So if I navigate just to networking, so we can also observe the bridge domains. We can see the different bridge domains that I have in place, the 3 subnets for my EPGs, and the one that is dedicated for the firewall. And lastly, if I navigate into contracts, navigate into standard, and I look for that specific contract that is the intra-ESG contract that you see right here, and I click under the subject, you will see that I am allowing any traffic. Now I will apply to this traffic a service graph, but before applying it, I will just navigate into FMC, right? And I will navigate into events and logs, unify events, and I will click on live traffic, right? So if I click here on live traffic, we will just see some alerts that I'm generating using one test script to generate a specific intrusion alert that we can see here, right? So for the time being, what I will do is I will navigate back to my APIC, and before assigning that service graph, if I navigate here under services, L4, L7, and under the devices, you will see all the different devices that I have available to apply a service graph. In this case, I will apply that service graph to the FTDV02 east-west. So if I come back to my permit source, any destination, any contract subject, and I apply that particular contract, let me just think there was a bit of a glitch here. Let's apply it again. And if I apply it now, and if I navigate back to the unified events, then we can see here how that traffic is being redirected into the firewall, right? We can see here how it's popping up, right? If I quickly filter here, for example, for front-end LB SciWeb, we should be able to see that traffic flows. Okay, so now that we are redirecting the traffic flows into the firewall, we know that the firewall is receiving it and is streaming telemetry into Secure Workload. So I will navigate into Secure Workload now. I will go to my manage connectors, and I will navigate to the new ACI connector, because what I want to show you here about this native integration, and we integrate with ACI by the means of an ACI connector, where you implement your specific username and password, right, to connect to that APIC node, is that we have multiple use cases, right? And the very first use case is as soon as you configure those parameters, you will do, or Secure Workload will do an endpoint discovery of your ACI endpoints. That is the first use case. The second one is about segmentation. So this is the native integration. I'm not highlighting and I'm not using that use case in this particular demo. We will see that in part 2. And the last one is about the status, where you see the TCAM utilization that we constantly monitor of your ACI fabric. So what I will do now is to navigate into organized label management, so you can quickly see how we are discovering and ingesting those different ACI constructs, right? You can see here all the different ACI constructs that we are ingesting from the fabric. For example, if I click here on the application profile, you will see the different application profiles that Secure Workload is discovering from ACI. So this is one, for example, as well, if you have the endpoint group, right, the different EPGs that we have seen on the ACI fabric. Now I will navigate to organize the scopes and inventory. I will click on the Acme organization, and I will click first here on data center. And notice here something, how I'm grouping the assets using different labels, right? In this case, a label that is defined by Secure Workload, and the other one that is coming actually from the APIC itself, right? From the ACI fabric. If I click here under production, you will see here that I'm actually getting as well from the Tech Elevate tenant. Yeah. And lastly, if I click here on SciWeb, you will see how I'm grouping those different assets, right? Using the endpoint groups to group those different endpoints in the ACI fabric. I will click here on the SciWeb application, and here is how we have discovered, right, those different policies for our application. You can see the front end talking to, for example, the DB nodes, the invoice logic, or the app tier talking to the backend, which is subsequently communicating to the DB nodes. We also see policy insights, right? For example, the hit counts that we have seen that traffic flow hidden, right? The trends, right? If traffic is increasing or decreasing, as well as different conditions for your policy, right? For example, if the policies are being used or not. So you have this classical view, right, of access control lists, but you can also select to visualize it using our policy canvas, right, which is a more user-friendly visualization tool to see how the different components of your applications behave, right, and the segmentation policies that they need. Now, if I click back here to the access control list view, something that we have introduced recently as well is the suggested policies, right? So our AI engine policy is always running into the traffic flows that we see from the network. In this case, we have visualized a rejected flow that you might want to consider to add to your policy, right? If it is not needed, that's perfectly fine. But the goal here is to always monitor for changes for your application so you can quickly add those new policies if you need, right? And help you operationalize that policy. All right. So we have our policy defined, right? Under policy analysis is the toolkit where we can verify that policy against that real traffic from the network, verify which policy is hidden, and that is allowing that traffic, right? And once that policy has been fine-tuned and defined and is ready to be enforcement, then you just need to follow our enforcement wizard to push that policy, right? I will do just a quick change so we can quickly deploy that policy. So what I will do, I will add here an additional port. I will say 443. I will add it to the list, right? And I will prepare to enforce this new policy into the network. And here you can see, right, the multiple changes that I have done to the policy. And what we're going to do here now is to push that policy. So I will just click next, 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 and accept and enforce. So once that policy is pushed, we are synchronizing it and we're orchestrating it into FMC, right? And the first stop that I will navigate here is to device and device management, where we will see the FTD in question. That is this FTD that you see over here, FTD 7282.02. Right? If I navigate into policies, access control, that FTD is assigned to the Tech Elevate East-West, right? And this policy is currently being managed by Secure Workload. If I click on Edit, you will see the policy that Secure Workload has pushed into FMC, right, automatically, and is constantly updating it, right? So if I expand this, you can see the different objects, right? Front end, DB nodes, back end, invoice logic, the port that they are talking to, the destination port, and the destination dynamic attribute, right? For example, shared services, backend. So essentially, we have here a one-to-one mapping that we're pushing into FMC to achieve that allow list policy model, right? All controlled, of course, by Cisco Secure Workload. All right. So with this, we terminate our demonstration, right, of how you can, let me just open back my PowerPoint. Let's switch over to the presentation mode. So we saw here, and just to brief, right, how we classify, right, and use EPGs to do that networking function in a dedicated application profile. We also group different endpoints under the SciWeb application profile, where we are using ESG to classify all of those different workloads or endpoints living there. And to this ESG, we apply three main contracts, right? If you may, it's similar to what we call this ring fencing approach, right? We are permitting traffic to that big ESG, right? So the ESG to talk to the external world, that ESG to receive traffic to the external world. And keep in mind that in this case, that traffic is being filtered by the north-south firewall. And for the ESG itself, right, or the app-to-app communications, we're making a redirect to our firewall, which is then streaming that telemetry into secure workload for policy discovery, and then is being managed directly by secure workload. All right, so having said that, I hope this demo has been informational, and thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much.